Let's get started because we have a lot of material to cover today. We're so grateful. We have so many wonderful presentations to come in and talk to us a little bit about how we can do some of this infill development and housing in our village centers using property that is already developed and ready to go. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Elisa, our CEO, to do a little bit of go through the agenda and do a welcome.
Thank you, Shauna.
There you go.
Yeah, you can hear me. You can see me. Okay. So Shauna is going to moderate our discussion today, but I wanted to take a minute to welcome you all and thank you for sharing your afternoon with us, and thank our partners, Ryan Castle from the Cape Realtors and Elizabeth Warfane from the Bid for co-sponsoring and co-hosting this event with us. It really is a collaborative effort, but behind the scenes, Shauna has been chasing the details and bringing us all together here. So thank you, Shauna, for getting us organized here. So I don't know what are we looking at? Are we looking at you, Shauna? Or are we looking at the agenda? Oh, sorry, I can't hear you. Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm not sure what everyone else can see. So we're not used to this. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, can everyone see the agenda? Not if you can. Okay, perfect.
That's okay, good. All right. So we have about 45 people registered, as Shauna said, and 10 different towns represented. So it's nice to have a collaborative community here that's learning and growing together to think about housing a little bit differently. We have all been kind of hand-wringing and stressing about the need for housing for over 20 years. And so we know right now our market is more treacherous than it has been in the past, and that we are losing our locals faster than we're building housing for them. So because we're not all about build in any location at any cost, we have spent the last 2 years working closely with the Association to Preserve Cape Cod to map out how each town can buy and focus housing development for open space and for housing, and that there are specific criteria that we have agreed upon where we both acknowledge that open space and preserving our environment is very important, and we both acknowledge that building housing, low density construction for apartments and condos is also very important. So later in March, we're gonna release those maps, and we'll be offering more sessions here with you all to learn about those maps and how to use them in your town. But in the meantime, we really wanted to start advancing the conversation about Main Street housing and the importance of Main Street housing, the construction, the economic value that they bring. And so it turns out that village centers are the perfect place for both housing, construction, and protecting our environment. So today we're going to hear from Kristy Senatori, who's the CEO of the Cape Cod Commission. She's going to walk us through the work that they've done to identify the village centers and the importance they have on housing throughout the Cape. We're going to hear from Jackie Beebe, who's the town manager in Eastham, and she's going to talk through their housing challenges, but also some of the very creative solutions and planning that they are putting in place to have hubs of activity in their town, to put an action plan together to build housing. And lastly, we brought in some national experts from upstairs downtown to share their learnings and their best practices about creating housing on main streets and some of the economic benefits that they've seen around the country. So I wanted to thank Representative Diggs for coming on. I believe he's on now. Is that right, Shauna? And again, thank my colleague Shauna for putting this all together. And I'll hand it over to you now to carry on from here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Here we go. So now we're going to go over to Kristy. So let me see if I can find you, Kristy, in the. There we go, Kristy. Everybody moves. Let's see. There you are. So Kristy, I will make you the co-host, and you should be able to share your screen then and run us through your slides. Thank you.
All right. here. Can everybody see that? Yes, okay, great. So thank you, Shauna, and thank you, Elisa, for the invitation to be here this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we have been doing over the course of the past several years to develop the regional policy plan, some of the work around identifying our place types, and specifically around future development in the community activity centers. And so let's see here. I want to start with this map series, and some of you who are familiar with the Commission's work may have seen this before, but what you're going to see is the parcel development by decade. So starting in the early 1900s through about 1930, you can see those darker shaded areas on the map are those parcels that are developed. You can see from 1930 to about 1960, certainly some more development happening across the region. And then that significant development that happened from about 1950 to 1990, taking us through to nearly the present day. So these are all of the parcels across the region that have been, that are currently developed. And so at the same time, during that period of time, we were good at protecting land as well. So about 40% or 90,000 acres of the Cape is actually protected open space. And so when you take all of those parcels that have been developed, you attach the map with the open space protected layer on top of it, what you get is about 86% of our land mass on the Cape that is either already protected or already developed. And so the reason I like to show this map series is really just to set the stage for a lot of the regional planning that we do. This isn't to say that the rest of it will be developed or necessarily protected, but what it tells us is that there is very little land left on the Cape that isn't yet developed or protected. And so we need to be mindful of our decisions as we move forward. And the conversation isn't around whether we're going to continue to grow as a region, it's where we're going to continue to grow. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is really around the regional policy plan, which sets the stage for much of our regional planning. This provides the framework for a lot of our additional regional plans, like our economic development strategy, our transportation plan, our wastewater plan, even our climate action plan. So a lot of what is incorporated in the regional policy plan and updated from time to time really does set the stage for the regional planning work, which is also helpful at the local level as well. And so much of the regional policy plan and much of what guides the Commission's work is protecting and preserving the region's resources, as well as focusing growth in centers of activity or areas that can accommodate that additional growth. And so even more simply put, the growth policy for Barnstable County is focusing growth in areas, centers of activity, and areas that are supported by adequate infrastructure, so areas that can accommodate additional growth and density. The development should be responsive to its context, and it needs to promote economic and community resilience. And so this is the growth policy that's incorporated into the regional policy plan, and it also is provided in many of our regional planning documents. So also incorporated into the regional policy plan is Cape Cod place types, and this was developed by our staff to really get a better understanding of some of the different and unique places that make up Cape Cod. And so you'll see these range from natural areas to rural development areas, those more suburban development areas across the Cape, certainly historic areas, which we have many of across the region, maritime areas, community activity centers, which I'll go into a little bit of detail on in a moment, industrial activity centers, and then certainly we have more unique military and transportation areas across the region. So the Cape Cod place types is something that's unique to our region. Certainly other areas across the country have designations like this for certain types of land use, but this is really specific to Cape Cod. And so we've actually had an opportunity to map some of these areas across the region as well. And so community activity centers, I wanted to provide a little bit of focus on today. And so the vision for some of these community activity centers, these are areas that can accommodate mixed use and multifamily residential development. They're more walkable, vibrant areas. So there's some of the downtown areas where we want to preserve some of the historic buildings, provide diverse services, shopping, recreation. Oftentimes these have civic spaces, housing, which is a focus in some of these areas, job opportunities. And again, just highlighting here that these are areas that have adequate infrastructure, either already in place or planned for, and a lot of the pedestrian amenities to support these more vibrant mixed use areas. So community activity centers, we've identified 17 across the region. And so they have a number of characteristics. And so this was actually a fairly robust GIS analysis that was conducted by our staff to identify these 17 areas across the Cape. And so they ranked highly in that terms of having community activity, these amenities for residents, business activity, so certainly areas that attract residents, that can attract visitors, and compact form. So these are obviously more walkable areas. So they're pedestrian oriented built environments. And so you'll see here on the map, these 17 areas that we've identified across the region that are identified as our community activity centers. And so lastly, just focusing your attention to some of the strategies. And so we have strategies for each of the place types in the regional policy plan. The community activity center strategies are encouraging some of that mixed use commercial and residential development in a compact form, supporting those vibrant downtown areas. The second one is really interesting, encouraging development at a human scale. So certainly facilitating interaction and a sense of community. So these are really areas that you're going to have a lot more pedestrian activities and amenities and units that are accommodating for additional types of diversity and housing.
One moment, Kristy.
Sure.
Kristy, there's a technical problem with the display because we're not seeing the full breadth of your slides. We're only seeing like the left half. I know you have a wider screen. I don't know if there's a way you can.
So it's been that way the entire time.
Shift your view or reduce the view on your screen. Maybe if you there, we can see, now we can see the whole slide.
Can you see the whole thing? Okay, so I'll just start here. So this is the last slide, but I will certainly share these with you, Shauna, so that you can make them available later. But this is the community activity centers. And so that I was down to the third strategy here. We're developing infrastructure that's necessary to support a greater density and mix of uses, including access to transit. And then incorporating pocket parks that create streetscapes to enhance the built environment and provide some community gathering places. So as I mentioned, all of our community activity centers and each of the place types within the designation by the commission actually have these strategies that we can look to incorporate as part of our regional planning and to incorporate into some of the local planning as well.
And so, Kristy, would you mind to go back to the map slide? Because I think it's great to see all the activity centers, the slide number 8. That's where you shot the 17. Yeah, because we only saw the upper and mid Cape activity centers. So now everyone can see the activity centers throughout the Cape.
Great.
That's helpful. Sorry for that. I'm not sure what happened.
All right, and so then my last slide is just my contact information as well as our website and a new data tool that we've created at datacapecod.com. You can also get there from datacapecod.org. Great, thank you, Kristy. So as Kristy said, I mean, we're recording this and we will have the slides, so we'll be able to share those later. And now let me just add in Jacqueline. I'm going to make you a co-host so you can say a few words while I am going to pull up your slides for you.
Awesome. So I feel like Kristy, good afternoon, first of all. I feel like Kristy gave the macro overview, which is terrific. And I represent a small town on the Outer Cape, which has less than 6,000 residents. So we're kind of a microcosm of what she's talking about, only we have some issues. So Eastham's challenges that we're trying to tackle include our size and population, our location as the entrance to the Outer Cape, and Eastham is also, you know, the gateway to the National Seashore. So a lot of our land is protected. But some of our challenges are that our land mass is bisected by, cleaved in half, I say, but by Route 6. A state highway runs right through the center of our town. We don't have a main street like most other Cape towns. And our commercial district is right off and adjacent to the state highway. We don't yet have a sewer system, just individual septic systems, which hampers development and new construction as well as redevelopment. Obviously, we have the same housing crisis that all the other Cape towns have, with limited economic development, and we're losing rentals, year-round rentals every year at a steady pace. So our limitations of housing, economic development, wastewater, not having an activity center, if we allow those to continue, it will dramatically affect the future of the town, the way it looks, the way it feels. And all of our plans and policies are future oriented to retain and build a sense of community. So if you want to switch to the next slide. I wanted to just mention that there is a specific vision that we have adopted, the select board, myself, our boards and committees, that housing and economic development for us are inextricably linked. The business needs a workforce, the workforce needs housing. We can't attract workers without that attainable housing. So it's all one big ball. Also, for us as a small town to make progress, we realize that we need to take on some of these endemic, insurmountable problems, like the fact that Route 6 goes through our town, like wastewater, like producing new housing in a very strategic way to maximize our capacity and our resources, and build capacity of our organization, which is the town, to build those resources. And we can't afford to do one thing at a time. So we have to do everything at once. It has to be coordinated, and it has to be on the same track and very tightly monitored to make sure that we don't get ahead. For instance, that we don't have development programs that get ahead of our wastewater development plan. So I look at plans as our roadmap. And I loved the regional policy plan, and we do use that, but we consider the fact, sort of strategically, that we have to start developing plans and build on them and use them. So please go to the next slide, Shauna. So for us, the first piece of planning we did in 2017 and 2018 was to ask the county, the commission, for help, because we were reacting to the fact that we had a big box store, Dollar General, that was planning on taking a space in our central business district. And it would have been a massive, 12,000, 15,000 square foot building. And the company made it clear that, Dollar Generals pick C-rated towns. So we were a C-rated town. I mean, how depressing is that? So we asked the commission for help, and they came in, and we did a DCPC, froze our zoning, took a look at what we wanted to create. So for the first time, it wasn't about what we didn't want, but what is it that we want to have there? Then the following year, we completed our strategic planning process, which really took what Elisa was talking about in the beginning, that balance, that discussion, that conversation about what should be developed and what should be undeveloped. What are our priorities? What are our values? What plans do get priority? And the strategic plan really took hold in Eastham, so much so that people quote it all the time. So I hear my own arguments used against me by board and committee members who are like, well, it fits the strategic plan and we really need the money to do it, which is really great. The market study came out of our acquisition of a large parcel of property that was up for a type of redevelopment we didn't want. So again, it went back to the DCPC stage. We purchased the Tea Time property, which is almost 11 acres right in our business district. It is undeveloped, it is flat, it is a perfectly lovely parcel. 2 years later, we also purchased the Town Center Plaza, which is an aging Central Plaza with 8 businesses that were going to be lost because the developer who was going to purchase it builds high-end housing. So it would have been all high-end condos, ruining that entrance to our business district. That parcel also allowed us to get access to Brockett Road. So we now have a 3.5 acre parcel with a 10 acre parcel on top with a few easements in between and an opportunity to create a main street for Eastham. So the market study helped us decide, what kinds of businesses, it was regional in nature, what kind of economic development do we want to attract? This year, we've rolled out our community housing plan, which pulls together all of the previous goals and just develops new tools for how we're going to tackle some of those problems. And we are in the middle of a master planning process for that Main Street concept that I just spoke about in our business district. So we go to my last slide, Shauna. So, we have the roadmap and now we're in process of building the road. And I think for us, we had to incorporate a wastewater management goal, a housing goal, a Main Street downtown goal, all into one package and roll it out. And that involved a commitment to increasing the capacity of town staff to be able to handle some of these issues. Eastham is also in the middle of a $130 million water project, which was postponed for many years, but we're in the middle of that and doing wastewater at the same time. So there's a lot of priorities for us. So basically, the select board and the town did make the decision to increase our capacity and dedicate funds. So we did hire a full-time economic development planner and a housing coordinator, also a full-time position, which are really helping us now put boots on the ground to do some of the things that we want to do. We remain dedicated to that overarching plan that all of our plans have to move together. All of the initiatives have to move together. And that requires an enormous amount of team collaboration. And we meet at least monthly to do that with all of our team partners. We are actively creating new tools and trying to engage new partners. And tools can be financial incentives. They can be a lot of different things, like I talk about in my next box there. New policy, new zoning, special legislation, a focus on redevelopment and increasing income levels on some of our traditional programs, and new programs to assist people to purchase homes, to assist people to create ADUs, things like that. We're actually trying to incentivize those with cash and with changes in our zoning and our policy. Part of our new partners are everyday people that own homes that want to create an ADU or may want to rent year-round as opposed to for a short-term rental, but they can't afford to do that because they can make a lot more money on a short-term rental. We're going to try and find a way to incentivize a year-round rental and actually give people cash to not rent on a short-term basis. So that's a new one we're going to try. We'll see how that goes. Basically, the whole concept of our new community housing plan is to incentivize and create what we want to see in our business district and in our town, which is a vibrant community that you can go to a Main Street concert, which is adjacent to the community center, which has a little green space for gathering and has retail and other businesses with housing over them and is integrated in a walkable community with transportation. So this year in 2022, we are jumping into our master planning process. We've hired a firm and really looking forward to that for the downtown district. We have 3 redevelopment projects that are on the town meeting warrant. We're purchasing 2 parcels, and we have the Main Street development going on simultaneously. We will be advancing 4 new zoning bylaws. We will advance 2 pieces of special legislation to increase income levels for some of our more traditional housing programs to allow us to assist people with just a little more income. And we're asking for funds for new program creation to incentivize specifically ADUs, but all kinds of other things as well. And I think that really Eastham has put its money where its mouth is. We're going to dedicate over $1 million just to housing in next year's budget alone. And I'm really trying to, again, tackle all 4 of those big problems that we have in one package, one step at a time over the next 5 or 6 years. Thank you.
You're muted, Shauna.
Well, then you didn't hear me say thank you. Thank you so much, Jackie. That's really helpful to kind of see all the different pieces that towns have to put in place and the many years that you've been going through this. That's great to look at. We're going to now move to Dan Carmody and Mike Jackson, who are from upstairs downtown, and they've done a series of essentially the Main Street revitalization programs, I think in 20 different communities around the country, mostly small towns like ours, and where they've really taken on some interesting tools that we haven't seen before, such as looking at building code and not just zoning, and other incentives and things like that. So I will make you a co-host, Dan, and you'll be able to share your slides. And Mike, you're next. There we go.
Hello, hello. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon, Cape Cod. Welcome from my Detroit-based bunker. I'm in the lower level since COVID set in. I hope to come to the light of day soon. Let me get my screen share working. I'm not seeing the screen share. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. How's that? Get this guy out of here. There we go. Shauna, can everybody see that good? Hello?
Seeing the whole slide.
Okay.
Sorry, I
thanks.
just muted myself.
So it's a pleasure to be here and to share with you the journey Mike and I have been on for the last almost 20 years. I come out of the community development world in the Midwest, where we dealt with a lot of economic dislocation in the 80s and 90s. And I find myself running a community-based nonprofit that worked hand in glove with the city of Rock Island to help revitalize its economy. And we focused a lot on industrial development, on neighborhood housing projects, and then a lot on downtown revitalization. Mike, on the other hand, career dedicated to historic preservation, spent a large part of his career as a state SHPO in Illinois, head of the state Illinois State Illinois Preservation Agency. And together in 2005, we came together. We had some success with upper floor development in downtown. We put together a series that focused on this vexing problem around Main Street communities throughout the United States. Oftentimes 50% or more vacancy on Main Street, and focused on towns smaller than 50,000 residents, usually smaller than 25,000 residents. But these aren't the projects that are going to attract developers. Our program is all about trying to help communities develop their capacity. Eastham pretty inspirational on their approach. Its scope, its comprehensive nature, very fascinating. We've been around the country presenting a 4-part series, driving a market for upper floor space in places that don't have the robust demand for housing that you all have. But that's the other side of the same problem. The affordability side is a huge issue as well for a lot of communities on the coast and around larger cities. Addressing buildings and their capacities, looking at your building stock with an eye towards revitalizing those parts of the building that may not be in active use. Financial assessment tools and case studies, incentive sharing best practices. Again, we've been in 20 places in 16 different states over the course of since 2005. This vitality that we all seek for our activity centers, for our village centers, it's all about adding bodies with disposable income. And you have some challenges that a lot of people don't have. 86% of your land's developed. So obviously land is scarce. Going up a little bit without threatening the character of the Cape, I think is a critical point. Lately, there's been an explosion of quality work around sort of increasing density without changing character. So the missing middle study that Union Studio did for the Cape, a lot of new urbanist thinking going into how to build, units 2 to 6 units in size. Light touch density is sort of the regulatory look at that from a very right-wing think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. Some fascinating research on how around the country, whether it's ADUs or row homes or above the shop, which is another phrase sometimes upstairs downtown gets. All of this is adding people without adding a lot of density in a way that just makes a lot of sense because it lets us keep our character as communities. So why is housing such a vital link? And I think over the last 50 years, as our city centers, particularly in smaller places, have been decimated by competition for the general users of Main Street, those independent retailers, those independent service businesses, there's been a surge in demand for housing that isn't detached single family housing. A lot of this has to do with the changing nature of American households. Some of that's demographic, some of that's just consumer taste driven, but there's all sorts of demand for housing besides just the traditional single family detached unit. And so again, those wide diversity of types that Mike will touch on fit into an area in and around activity centers or village centers that helps add density. People seek out places with this neighborhood walkability. And what I especially like about housing as an economic development tool is while I appreciate the broad scope and the very iterative thinking that Eastham has put into their approach, what are those things we can do that we can do now? How can we build a bias for action? And some of these small scale housing things are going to make sense regardless of some of the fine points of your strategy. And it lets people begin to buy in that this isn't just another, I don't know about you all, but in Detroit, we have this whole theory of work around people as being burnt out about too much planning and not enough action. And I think it affects a lot of our towns. One of the biggest advantages we don't talk enough about is that spending power for those people that living near our village centers. Each resident, and this is old data, this is 24, this is before a little bit of inflation. This is data from the state of Michigan Main Street program. Each new resident added almost $20,000 in new disposable income to help downtown merchants prosper and stay viable. That's an important characteristic, how housing helps. Now, our city centers, our village centers, our town centers, they've declined because we've lost all of this traditional retailing and general services that used to populate Main Street. I wasn't perhaps as aware of how far we'd fallen until I had the wonderful opportunity to do a sabbatical in Greece. And I went to Greece because at that time, Detroit was going through bankruptcy and the nation of Greece was going through bankruptcy. And what I found in small, medium-sized Greek towns was still storefront retail that was excellent in quality. Now, certainly the Greeks need to stretch their dollars. They're going through some tough economic times. but perhaps they didn't sell their soul for low prices and convenience. Perhaps a Greek resident would never buy something to furnish their housing unit from somebody who wasn't a blood relation, whether it's a third or fourth cousin. That cultural aspect is huge in Greece. But it really reminded me of how little market share our independent retailers that make up the backbone of our main streets and village centers have left in this country. And then you add the effects of the Great Recession, and then the significant market share increase for home delivery during the pandemic, and you have even worse business conditions. Demographics also plays a role. You know, we've had a long time shift to smaller households, in addition to a lot more diversity of what those household types are. The number one household in the 2010 and 20 censuses were couples with no kids. And the second most common household type was the single person. So a lot of these smaller units that we're talking about, the accessory dwelling units, those work for a lot of those audiences. But this overall reduction in household size means for the same number of units, if you don't add those additional light touch density housing units, you're going to have fewer and fewer people in the same amount of space. Now, we've gone from 3.3 people per household in 1960 to just under 3, just 2.5 almost in 2010. Now, uptick a little bit. 2020 census is the first time in 160 years that household size actually increased. And I think this was the national issue with regard to affordability. You've got generational households living together because either mom and dad can't afford to live on their own, or the kids can't afford to live on their own. And then you had a little bit in the 2020 census, you also had the early effects of the pandemic started to factor into some of those numbers. And you all have, of course, the issue of seasonal residents. And, 37% of your housing stock in 2020 was, quote, vacant, end quote. That's what the Census Bureau calls seasonal residents. But that's an 8% decrease. Actually, year-round residents increased by 8% between the 2010 census and the 2020 census. And I think that was probably accelerated as stories that we've heard from Shauna and others, that during the pandemic, a lot of seasonal folks decided to make their seasonal home their year-round home. So that's good news, bad news, but there's just increasingly crunch. But from a Main Street perspective, you still have more than a third of your housing is only being used a few months of the year, and that's hard to sustain a business on Main Street with that the case. So the impacts of high vacancy are a perception of failure. It's a greater dependence on residential property taxes. So as we look to fund our municipal function, having a healthy central business district helps increase commercial real estate taxes. It's a huge advantage. And keeping those businesses we do have in survival, let alone prosperous mode, more and more difficult with higher vacancies, fewer reasons to come to the community center. On the flip side, why is it important to revitalize them? Well, when you get active downtown, the source of pride in the place grows, the quality of life improves. When you don't have to drive 50 miles to get essential goods and services, but you can get them walking to them. It's a huge game changer. It's also important because with your limited resources and with the amount of funding it takes to extend infrastructure, not even talking about water, just concrete streets and sidewalks. The AEI report estimated it's $50,000 a unit across the country to add a unit at the edge of town. When you're talking about main streets, when you're talking about village centers, you can add housing units with a very small fractional cost to any infrastructure. So it's a huge cost efficiency for local governments to be able to add housing in the center of its place rather than at the edge. Now, we had success in Rock Island, I think, for two reasons. One is we started and looked very intensely in small sections. Like Eastham, we did a fabulous strategic plan, but we didn't get too much in the master planning process. We got busy doing things. We had a housing organization that was capable of larger projects. But we focus very much on an incremental approach, seeing housing as a key driver to drive a more vibrant downtown. The housing organization took on some of the bigger white elephant buildings, half a dozen different old department stores that had long been vacated. These became the subject of complicated financing with low-income housing tax credits and trying to mix and match other people's money to get, over 400 units built in about an 8-year window in a town of 35,000 people. Now, at the same time we were doing the big projects, one of the things that really fell into place was the city had a tax increment finance district, and the city, with some advocacy from our behalf, invested in smaller properties. Projects less than 6 units in size needed a simple incentive. These weren't projects that a developer was going to take on. These were projects that a building owner was going to take on, or a building owner and a buddy who is a contractor could take on. And so this program succeeded, created about 64 units over a 7-year period by providing a $20,000 per unit investment for any property that had not been occupied in the last 5 years. I'm sorry, 20,000 for any that had not been occupied. It was only 10,000 for units that just needed spruce up that had been recently occupied. It could only cover 40% of the project cost. It became a forgivable loan if the project was successful and was still in use after 5 years. And the first floor business had to stay in business to get that forgivable loan. A simple tool for smaller projects, funded from local sources. As I looked at what HAC is doing, it sounds like Eastham is doing the My Home Plus One, the ADU funding is very similar to that. And as we've seen around the country, around the world, it's a pretty consistent number. Amsterdam in the Netherlands, one of the most dense, vibrant cities in the world, provides a $26,000 equivalent incentive to convert any vacant upper floor space into a living unit. Now, we've seen that number go up a little bit in recent years with the great spike in construction costs, but $25,000 to $35,000, $40,000 per unit that isn't complicated really helps to get small property owners interested in developing dormant, vacant, unused space that they're in their buildings. So this helps build that bias for action, giving small developers a simple financial incentive to incentivize small projects. We've been around the country. Mike and I, we had a banner year in 2021, and we've seen a lot of communities starting to even use their ARPA funding for downtown housing. Two communities in Kansas that we've been working with have allocated to help get upper floor development happening in places with 50, 60% vacancy rate. So just encourage, as you're thinking about how to attract more small scale development, keep those tools simple to be a incentive to help. The land use regulations do matter, and Eastham and the Cape Cod Commission are right to be looking at how the regulatory framework can really be made to help assist density around community centers. From the AEI report that just came out, a great look at 6 communities just off the, I think, George Washington Bridge in Bergen County in New Jersey, suburbs to New York, healthy housing demand. Since 1939, Palisades Park has had the by right use for single family lots to be able to build duplexes. Over the course of the last 80 years, they've led their neighbors with the largest increase in population. Their homes and commercial establishments have the highest property values. Their owners pay the lowest real estate taxes, and they have the most active city center. A little bit higher density, still no bigger than 2 units, but a little bit higher density has gone a long way to making Palisades Park improve financially for all that are concerned. So these are arguments. They're still, the single family home isn't going to go away. The detached single family home is here to stay. but how do we give people more options to take advantage of the change in households? And how do we develop a wider variety of housing types with an eye towards increasing density? Now, in the middle of Nebraska, Randall Chick and a small group in Hastings provided some exceptional leadership. Over the last 10 years, they've been able to build 85 upper floor units in the city of 24,000 people, with a recent focus on corporate short-term stays. So they've got some larger employers that have a hard time attracting full-time employers to the middle of Nebraska, so they bring them in on short-term contracts. And this town's been able to provide some really nice housing to make those sophisticated, higher income individuals feel at home in Hastings. We liked it because it contrasted with North Platte, Nebraska, population 26,000, about 104 miles away, that hadn't had any significant downtown housing. Two similar communities, both downtowns had some good bones. One of them was successful because they identified an opportunity and they built the community capacity to deliver it. So in the case of Hastings, they established both a business improvement district, which I believe there's one in Hyannis. I don't know if there's any others on the Cape, but they also created a community revitalization area, which is a TIF, tax increment funded mechanism. So they had both a special rate on their local property taxes, plus the diversion of any increase in rates to support Main Street initiatives. They got turned on to housing early by going to a national seminar in Denver, produced by the National Development Council. They got some tips on how to put together some incentives. But their first project, their proof of concept, their pilot, they just funded entirely themselves. They got it done. They showcased in a lot of places that don't have upper floor inventory. The only people left living on the upper floors tend to be people that are dragging on a unit that's 60 or 70 years old and don't have any other choices. So this is trying to create a whole new market, and they found a way to demonstrate proof of concept, and then they were able to back off their investment, participating as they need to develop projects over time. This is a team sport. And so if you don't have a developer that's coming with his full complement of team members, we as communities have to build this team in place. And so this slide, which, there's a lot of information here, the types of people you need to help do an upper floor project, it's extensive, especially when you're talking with historic preservation opportunities, both from how to get it done, as Mike will talk about, some of the challenges with regard to standards, but also how do you take advantage of some of the historic preservation tax credits. These can be complicated deals, even the smaller ones. So you start with the simple ones, you move to more complex ones, but you have to build the team. And I did like Eastham's focus on community capacity. I would argue that all of our towns need exceptional leadership. And we define exceptional leadership as leadership to the third power. And to me, it's a combination of knowledge. What do we need to do? And so all the planning that Eastham's been doing is wonderful. You should have an excellent roadmap by the time you're done with your master planning process. Knowledge alone isn't enough. You got to have the capacity to act. And there's a number of different variables there. I do break those two down into subunits in a longer presentation, but knowledge times capacity generally leads to exceptional leadership. Now, success to me is when opportunity meets outstanding leadership. And nearly all of our towns will eventually encounter success. And certainly there's no reason on the Cape with your fabulous international tourism, with the quality of life that's a destination for so many people, you have an outstanding level of opportunity. If you have exceptional leadership, you'll do just fine. If you don't have exceptional leadership, quite frankly, wait for it, you're simply SOL. So moving from leadership to exceptional leadership, great case study there in Eastham. I'm sure that other communities around the Cape have done similar things. There are 5 core characteristics to me that really make up a successful place-based initiative. And to remember them, just think of EIEIO. So those 5 characteristics quickly are the first E is for the empirical. What's the data? What are the dynamics? What's the economics? you've got the HAC is a wonderful resource. We need to understand, and there's so many reports that the Cape Cod Commission and others have put together with regard to that opportunity for sort of light touch density or for the missing middle type projects. What are these reuse or infill opportunities? Is it just residential? I think there's probably some office pieces, and obviously you're trying to rein in a little bit your short-term lodging, but there's different forms of that might be available as well. What's your building stock? How do you assess that? Which are the easier ones? How do you get started on the easy ones? Leave the tougher ones for later. What's the economic analysis? What are the building costs? What are the rent rates? All of that data needs to be crunched so that if there is a gap, you know what it is, and it can be a realistic gap that doesn't use taxpayer money to enrich in somebody that doesn't need it, but at the same time, how to use public sector money to achieve the goal of building more housing and solving this affordability problem. So empirical data is critical. Incrementalism is key. One of the things we've found in communities is one of the places, in all places where construction costs are an issue, one of the places to look for early adapters is local builders. This is Bob, a builder from Fort Wayne, Indiana, who he and his wife, the kids had left the house. He wanted to have a gourmet upper floor downtown residence and built this very sexy 6,000 square foot space. It included an amenity I didn't know existed. That's a pet shower you're looking at right there. But it had the gourmet kitchen, but it was all built over Bob's workshop in his warehouse and in place where he had his office for his construction company. So when you're thinking incrementally, thinking about those early pilots, think about your local builders who can bring to the table the control of those out of sight construction costs and maybe have enough community pride to want to really err on the side of quality and do a really cool project. Now, the entrepreneurial side, that's what made our main streets what they were in the day. We need to be that place that's reserved for independent businesses. Couldn't agree more that the Dollar General store doesn't really belong in the historical context of our community centers, our village centers. But 50% of our workforce, estimated by the American College Testing Service that does career surveys, within 3 years, 50% of the workforce is expected to be consultants. The gig economy is here. The recent pandemic, people learn to work remotely. There's still a lot of people who don't necessarily want to work from home. Co-working spaces in Detroit are on fire, I think around the country, they're doing pretty well right now. So that can be another use, whether it's on the first floor or taking advantage of some of the new space created in the mixed use projects. We need to think entrepreneurially, and housing fits in very closely because people might want that live work unit. They might want to have a residential unit nearby that has a co-working space not too far, all within walking distance. Inclusion is critical. Who's going to be our barista for all the Tony visitors that come during the season? We got to have housing for people that work in the shops, the town centers, the village centers, the community activity centers. Really need to think about 4 different flavors of housing. Owner occupied this market rate, owner occupied this affordable, capital A affordable, small a affordable. And by that, I mean, there's affordable housing that just gets left over when it's not very much improved. And then there's the affordable housing with a capital A that's brand spanking new and built with a lot of the federal and state resources that are around available for capital A affordable housing. But we also need to look at the rental market, both market rate and affordable. So it's village centers are the one place where those forms can all come together and generally blend in so that nobody really knows what the income is of any one particular resident. Lastly, you have wonderful organic quality. Organic is the EIEIO. We got to be the best we are. It's the same authenticity is quite a hot phrase right now. To enhance our authenticity, to make our place that is authentic better, we got to activate those underused spaces, whether it's upper floors, whether it's infill, or whether it's popping the top, a phrase I don't particularly like, but it was the shortest phrase to maybe putting on a second story or replacing 1-story buildings with 2-story buildings or 3-story buildings even. Those are all different options of increasing density just a little bit, or light touch density. While we talked mostly about housing, office and hospitality are other options to keep in mind. Keeping that focal point on independent businesses for those first floors requires a bit of incubation, I think, these days. Farmers markets are still hot, and they're still a place to really, along with other pop-ups, are giving people the chance to start their business with low overhead, as is co-working space. And then lastly, while we talked a lot about income diversity in the form of housing, we also need to be thinking about income diversity in our commercial space to make sure that we can continue to incubate businesses that might not be ready to graduate to what the market might demand in some of our main streets. So all in all, there's a huge opportunity here. Mike is going to focus in on some of the code, and both zoning and building code issues that we've seen from around the country, that there's a financial barrier to getting some of these projects done. And that can be, that barrier, that gap can be reduced by providing incentive, raising more funds to spend on the project. But increasingly, I'm convinced that there are ways to cut costs without cutting quality. Sprinklers are perhaps one of the most subscribed solution to fire safety, as Mike will talk about. And if you can eliminate that building code official who thinks sprinklers is the only answer, you can move up many projects from the edge of financial feasibility to the over the top and get them done. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Mike, and I, along with Mike, will be ready for questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Dan, you have to unshare your screen.
Okay.
All right, let's see, here we go. All right. All right, can everybody see me okay? First slide up.
You're good to go.
Okay, Dan and I have partnered for years. Dan is the planner, omnibudsman, carrying it all. I'm the architect, designer, preservationist. I'm going to drill down into some of the details, but we put it together on Main Street. Last year, we did a lot of work in Kansas. This is a typical Midwestern Main Street, but it has this small scale, uniform, two-story buildings. Walt Disney copied this when he did Disneyland's Main Street. We're working with the real stuff. You have some of these traditional Main Street centers. I know Hyannis is here in this group with a bid, and you have some of this, but it's somewhat smaller. It's around, but you've got your 17 activity centers, and I assume you've done some of your historic designation of some of this. We have really tried hard to break down the economic barriers to getting this downtown housing. And it really is economic, but sometimes the barriers come from the regulatory side, zoning and building codes, or the lack of professional capacity. And I'm an architect, and yet I've been in towns where a local architect will say, well, I don't know why they asked me to look at those projects because they never work out. There's just too many problems. So, we want everybody working to find the solutions. There is a negative perception about upper floor housing downtown, and this is one of those places of negativity. Unfortunately, if you Google upstairs downtown, you'll get this country and western song about a crappy downtown apartment that the only person that they could only afford, and they didn't have a successful life living there. So we're overcoming that barrier of that perception. You started a while ago with your study on the Cape Cod Town Center revitalization, looked at the variety of town centers. This is from 15 years ago. You identified some different character types to your centers, your city centers. You got the smaller ones, the bigger ones. And I know Hyannis is one of the larger, and then you've got your Mashpee Commons project, which is a big scale developer. But in your study, you did a checklist of issues, zoning issues. And I've already heard some of that today, that you're looking into that. But one of the things that it said is housing allowed in the upper stories. Occasionally we start with a town where they actually have a zoning provision prohibiting housing downtown. And that's because of that perception that it was not good enough for housing anymore. And it was an out of sync land use. So you got to stop by reducing a main barrier And then we'll get into the details of how we can work beyond that. But let's take and get rid of any immediate barriers. The typical Main Street building that we work with was plotted in the 19th century on about a 20-foot lot line. And I understand the standard surveyor's form in the 19th century was 22 feet. And we built incrementally. Well, our program works incrementally the same way. One building at a time, one story at a time, bringing buildings back and putting the uses back in there and getting things back to where they're viable again. Our buildings did not start out vacant. We built buildings, and this was a publisher's book from the 1910 on how to build stores and flats. And you can find these all over America's cities and small towns. But nobody has produced a book like this in 100 years of common examples of how to build multi-story or two-story buildings downtown. It's on my wish list. But it's also about, to us, it's improving yourself. The Pincheck is a paint store, but they basically, this is my segue to take that up for story, and you've got to do it. The large developers are not looking for small scale buildings. So we've definitely got to get more capacity working in the downtowns. I see some of you are raising your hands and talking about things. We're going to get questions at the end. One of the things we found is that there's a strong market force for 1 up to 2 bedroom units in downtowns, 800 to 1,200 square feet, washer and dryers in the unit. The 1+ unit is a 1 larger bedroom and a study, which has a lot of viability today as another unit type. And this is the kind of programmatic scale we look at when we do conversion projects today. There's a lot of talk around the country about this, the 5+1. You build a concrete building on the first floor, you put a wood frame structure on the top, and these are being built in massive numbers across America's cities. But this is out of scale for you. This is not what you're looking at. This is larger urban areas of the country. You're into this market niche, and this is only a recent study. This term comes out, it's being promoted by the Congress of New Urbanism, the missing middle. You have a huge amount of detached single family housing. You don't have much high rise or mid rise, but this kind of scale, and interestingly, this kind of scale doesn't even talk about the mixed use commercial Main Street building, is very viable for this light touch density. Your Cape Cod missing middle study identified a number of excellent housing types that have light density, but fit the vernacular and character of Cape Cod. Working with, again, the gray shingles, the trim, et cetera. So there's lots of ways to build this in architectural compatibility. And the missing middle study that was done for you had one idealized new town center where the upper floors of the buildings can be residential or commercial, wrapping around a central space. The mixed use Main Street Center. We saw this nationally done. This is Seaside, Florida, done in the 1990s. It's really just a tourism town. It's not a real town in some ways, but this form has something that works well for you in terms of a setting, a place, a scale, and showing how a lot of individual parts can complement each other. You've got one larger development that's been done, the Mashpee Commons, that is, again, one large scale developer doing things. So, okay, you found one niche for that lifestyle center that builds off of this vernacular. But our programs and our emphasis has been the multiple players, many smaller projects coming together into one. In your study that you did on housing 15 years ago, you showed the pop the top. What could we do if we had, instead of single story plain commercial buildings, that residential component on the upper floor? It does a lot to preserve the character of your area, as well as adding this density, and puts that person living downtown who's going to spend their money. Now, zoning ordinances are critical, but zoning ordinances are all about use and setbacks and parking ratios, et cetera. Design guidelines were one of the frequent things we work with in our Main Street communities to go beyond zoning. Well, out of that has come a new thing, form-based codes, which basically are an integration of design guidelines into the codes that promote ways to build so that you basically can get the traditional Main Street building with 2 stories, housing up above, and bring back something that was once so common in America and make it work. And there's some economies of scale in doing this at larger building footprints, but still breaking up the massing so that it looks like more incremental development. Dan talked about urban pioneers, people showcasing it. Often it might be somebody that's doing something special. We've been gathering case studies over the years. This is one of my favorites, an architect in Champaign, Illinois, who put a loft studio apartment downtown in 1960. So this is before the loft movement in New York City, looking at what can a simple upper floor space be turned into in terms of a new unit type of housing. So an urban pioneer in the loft movement. But this is probably a better replicatable model in some ways for you. And this is in Galesburg, Illinois, one of the 3 pioneering Main Street test case study communities in America. A local developer, Jay Madsen, acquired a series of buildings on both sides of the street and then started working on the retail and then got into the upper floors. One of these buildings had a slipcover on it. These are new bay windows added on there. And basically, what he has done is create units on the second floor. But what he did, besides just making these regular units up there, is at the back, he built outdoor decks. There's an elevator here, so there's a common elevator to the outdoor decks, a covered garage building. So these are units that really appeal to a more permanent type resident. Oftentimes it's a single or older couple, middle-aged, don't want to maintain a house, want this housing type. They're not buying a condo, they're still renting, but by grouping this together, he made one elevator work for all 7 units. It's hard to afford to put an elevator in a 2-story building, but when you combine them, you can spread that cost out. It's somewhere in the 7 to 10 units are needed to really justify the elevator expense. You have a huge market for short-term rental, your vacation rental market. Galena, Illinois is a tourism town in northwestern Illinois. They basically had the same thing you had, conversion of housing stock into short-term rental. They basically changed their zoning ordinance and stopped all residential rental conversion short-term in their residential area. They only allow it in the downtown, and it's booming. This space up here is now an Airbnb unit. This is what it looks like. It rents, at basically the monthly rent for a Airbnb unit is about triple what a typical residential unit would rent for. So this makes the marketplace work. And if the Airbnb market ever changes, then it can go back to becoming residential housing again. But their innovation was saying, let's push this in the downtown, take it out of the residential area. New Orleans is actually doing the same thing right now with that to prevent displacement in their residential areas. Now I'm going to touch base a little bit on building codes because it's a complicated part of building and what it is. You have in Massachusetts, as I understand it, you adopt the International Building Code, and then it's applied across the jurisdictions. In some states, like in Illinois, every town adopts their own, but at least you have some larger uniformity. Building codes are a lot based upon fire safety, and they really developed out of that, the whole way in which we identify buildings and their type of construction, et cetera. And I've highlighted something here, but the fire detection and alarm is the single most important life safety device of the 20th century. It really is just so critical. Early warning, get people out of buildings. That is fire safety. The other things we used to do with thick masonry walls and compartmentalization were the traditional ways in which we did things. And it's only in the more recent years, really in the 1970s on, that we started to promote sprinklers as the solution. But as I say about sprinklers, they're always desired, not always required. And we have found that this is oftentimes one of the critical cost issues for a housing conversion. If you don't have the water capacity and you have to get a whole new system and a big water line in, the sprinkler could be a make it or break it number for a small housing conversion unit. So this is one of the things that we look at in more detail. Within the international existing building code, there is one code with 3 code paths. And what's very interesting is the performance compliance method, which is a scoring system of fire safety, is very effective in developing fire safe conversions of upper floors that may not trigger a sprinkler system for small scale buildings. So we're increasing our training on the use of this tool. And there's not been a lot of that training out there. So we see it's a weakness in the capacity nationally. Fire codes and changes are often triggered by change of use. So sometimes it's important to understand what was the use of your upper floor on your building. And two places have done something very innovative with this. The California Historic Building Code states that any prior use of an historic building can be used as the existing use. So in other words, if your building was originally built with housing on the second floor, and in 1960, they converted it to an office, and you want to convert it back to residential, under the California Historic Building Code, that's not a change of use, which often triggers higher safety requirements. Wisconsin allows the use of the International Residential Code for the second story residential use on a small 2-unit building, with a increased fire separation between the two. Again, an innovation that allows a less strict building code for the second floor. The residential building code became a hot issue in 2009 when the International Code Council said all new residential units are required to have sprinklers. Well, there was a huge amount of backlash against that, led by the national home builders. Massachusetts, as I understand, does not require sprinklers for 1- and 2-family homes, and because it's a big cost issue. But that jurisdictions, whether it's at the state or local level, that's been fairly much the common thing, is to remove that. Now, this is really interesting. This is recent. This is as of January 22. Memphis is pioneering the use of the International Residential Code for 3- to 6-unit residential structures. So as it would be today, more than 2 units, you have to go to the commercial level of building, higher costs, higher design costs, higher permitting costs, separate mechanical, plumbing drawings, et cetera. Basically, Memphis is going to let the residential builder do the 3- and 6-unit buildings. So by this simple change of the building code to allow a less strict code for small scale residential, they're hoping to unleash a whole small scale developer community of builders to get into the housing market that has largely been outside of their purview. This is extremely innovative. We're very excited to see what's happened with this because it's so new. We don't know the impact of this, but very daring on the part of the city of Memphis to say, let's really go for this to try and work for this missing middle housing. In our Main Street work, we found the building code issue comes up a lot. This year, we're partnering with the Association for Preservation Technology, which is a national group that promotes building practices for conservation. Summer of 2022, we're doing a virtual workshop on building codes on Main Street to bring up a lot of the things I'm talking about today. So this is sort of new best practices on the building code side. We also like to promote in our Main Street communities the use of annual tours and events to promote upper floor housing. If you've got a traditional place like Hyannis and you've got some housing, this is a great activity to do on an annual basis. Some of our communities have been doing this for 15 years now. And it's a really great program to promote both exceptional availability and empty places that could be converted in recent projects. Madison, Indiana does a program and they call it See How the Upper Half Lives. So anyway, a lot of this is going on quickly. I'm trying to touch just some highlights on the building construction design side of this. More of this information, including our past presentations, are available on our upstairsdowntown.com website. As we've said, we're revitalizing downtowns 1 story at a time. At this point, I'm going to turn off my screen sharing and we're going to open up to questions. I know there's been a bunch of participants raising their hand. Dan?
Great. Okay, one moment. I wanted to just bring in, we have a slide just to talk about some additional ways that we can keep things moving. And also, I wanted to ask Kip Diggs. I see that you're on, and I wanted to give you the opportunity if you wanted to say anything at this time before we jump into the questions.
I just want to say thank you. This was a great, great talk here. I liked it. A couple of things that was said. I mean, we're a gateway city in Hyannis, a gateway community, and who would have thought that we were or we are a gateway community, and that's at least in Hyannis, and that's kind of, sad to say, but it's the truth. But if we could come up with some ideas that, to make Main Street Hyannis marketable, so that we can get more people walking the streets, but also living in that area, man, that could just really help out things. And then, of course, helping out, Hyannis being our city of the town, but also being able to make sure, the other villages can help out and do various things in their spots. We have to change a little bit, get a different mindset, and do have to communicate and work together. So I honestly think this is a great, this was great. So thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Representative Diggs. I'll go through some in the chat. I have one question that came through was, could you comment on revitalizing main streets in towns with a mall corridor like we do in Barnstable? As malls renew and renovate, it seems like a challenge for Main Street to keep up. And you can jump in if you want to add some more detail to that question. Are you talking, is this a question, I think, about the competition from our Cape Cod Mall and our main streets, which are actually not very far apart in Hyannis?
Are you asking me if that's my question? It is.
Yeah, Jen, is that, am I grabbing your question?
Yeah, that is my question. Because, we've been working tirelessly really for the entire time I've been a town councilor on improving Main Street, and we're getting there. But now we have a new and very welcome, I have to say, renovation happening at the old Kmart Plaza. And, we don't want our efforts on Main Street to be kind of lost in the shuffle. So I just wondered if you guys had any experience in dealing with those issues in other areas of the United States.
Well, I can say from my experience in Rock Island that we were responsible for the whole city, not just the downtown. So the bad news is that all of those Kmart plazas, regional shopping malls, we're all in a world of hurt now. So, I mean, it's you got to figure out what the strategic position of each property is. And so I think when you're looking at a Kmart plaza, that the distinction typically is it's one owner versus fragmented ownership. And so again, to the extent that I think you need to bring that developer in for the discussion to see how the two can work off of each other, not just let it rip. And so typically it's a bigger footprint. Typically it's more national or regional businesses than the Main Street might be working on. So you're still a greater focus on independent retailers in the Main Street than on a repopulating a large strip mall. But certainly there's overlap between those two markets. And so how can one complement the other? There's there is a lot of diversity in the market right now in terms of business types. But everybody's still, at-home deliveries are still taking market share away from brick and mortar. So I think as communities, we have to integrate our discussions with those other than Main Street retail establishments that we have, whether it's a regional shopping mall or it's strip centers.
Dan, we had a successful project in Waukegan, Illinois, that was the conversion of the Kmart to a new charter high school, right near the downtown.
Okay, there's, I just have one other raised hand and we're getting close to the end. Stephen, are you able to unmute?
I am able to unmute. People have been trying to do that to me for, never mind. So great presentation, but on Cape Cod, we have a height restriction of, I believe, 33 feet. You can't go up until building regulations are changed to adapt to that. So all this talk about buildings above is a moot issue on Cape Cod because of that building height restriction. And of course, we don't
Stephen,
want that to go overboard so that the houses look like towers, but there needs to be a modification there if we're going to have second floor residences over businesses, which is a great idea.
Stephen, what's the height limit right now?
It's 33 feet, but who's here from the planning board that I saw?
Right, that's definitely one of the things that we were talking about, looking at, again, what would you do to change the zoning in those specific areas? Again, not saying we're going to paper the entire Cape that way, but looking at community activity centers and, you know, that certain areas might be certain areas of Main Street where you might allow it.
33 gets you to 2 stories. Maybe not 3, but
Right.
but it's still.
Well, if you just increase the height by 10 feet, for example, you've got another floor, or you could take a loft space in the gable and make at least one of the rooms of the apartment up there.
Right.
So first floor business, second and a half, or second and 3/4 would be habitable spaces. But then you may, I'm not a building, problem of elevators and access to those second floor apartments, which would be either a fire escape or an elevator, and that gets a bit pricey for the homeowners.
Okay, Mike.
The elevator issue is related to ADA and accessibility laws. And again, at the small scale development issue, that's generally not a huge issue when you're doing small numbers. But that's something that has to be brought into it. I think your zoning issue, this is ideal for you to have thinking about a form-based code instead of just absolute 33 feet is the number. What's the way to shape the form that works to allow this additional housing? Because you're right, this is a trigger point of if you are restricted in height, it's going to limit, but you don't have to go to unlimited, that's for sure.
And on a national level, the elevator question is when do you need it in terms of the market? And generally speaking, if you want to go to 3 stories, you probably need an elevator. If you're just doing 2 stories, you probably don't need an elevator.
Mhm.
And the only
this
issue
is
is
a
on
good
larger
segue.
housing complexes, when you have a larger number of units, I think over 20, then you get into requirements under accessibility rules.
Yeah, and this is a good segue into the next steps. And that's why, you know, Dan and Mike do a 2-day or a 4-part series of trainings with towns when they're ready to really dive into these details, where you can have gone through and done your survey of your vacant lots, your vacant buildings, or upper floors of buildings that you have in your community activity centers. So you can start to see what do you have to work with and where might you want to consider some of those changes, right? And so that's something that we could always, you know, if there's community interest in this, you know, we could bring them back to do a more in-depth training later in the year where they really dig into that. And I know they like to actually go and see the bones of the buildings, and it's very specific to the neighborhood and what's already existing there, which is great. So just to summarize, as we're running out of time here, that's one of the first things that we can do to sort of be prepared as community leaders and town officials and all of us, is to kind of, how can we move forward that survey of where are those empty and underutilized spaces that we want to focus our housing on. So let's start looking at those and looking for those opportunities. Then by finding out where those are, then we can consider the overlay districts that are going to allow multifamily housing, or housing at all if it's not allowed on the second floor, right? That might be an easy fix. Consider funding incentives like they talked about that will encourage the smaller property owners to come in and do those projects that are 2 to 6 units. You know, the big developers are never going to come in and do that for us. So we have to make it work for the people in the community, for them to do it themselves. We will be offering some more Cape Housing Institute workshops in April. As Elisa mentioned, we will be launching the Association to Preserve Cape Cod and HAC joint maps, where we've gone through and looked at all of the data from the regional policy plan and the community activity centers and the priority natural resource protection areas. And we've gone through and identified, again, those areas where we both agree that are priorities that should be preserved for natural resource and that should be explored for moderate density housing. And so again, our idea is with the bias towards action that Dan and Mike talk about is that like, let's look at the ones where we have broad agreement and see where we can't make movement there. So that's really where the MAP project will come in, and there will be a series of workshops on that. There will be a series of town meetings on that where we get into the very specific towns. And we are considering doing another workshop that really dives deep into this Main Street and the building codes and incentives and some things that we can do beyond zoning, because most of our workshops have kind of stopped at zoning, but there's more we can do. And with that, I wanted to just say thank you on this. I think I have one raised let's see, do I have one raised hand? I think I have one raised hand. Sarah, did you want to say one quick thing before we sign off?
Yeah, I wanted to thank you all, and just to say, I thought it was a great presentation, but I wish we had talked a little bit about the ecological sustainability as we develop new housing, both in terms of preparing for climate changes, but also to make the heat and utilities of the houses affordable and sustainable to the residents, especially if they're low income housing. And I think we can integrate those goals into the fine goals that you all laid out here today.
Yeah, I agree. And that is one of the reasons why we were able to come to, such agreement with the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, that there are certain areas where it's good to cluster housing development because we're able to do that with less impact on the environment. Dan talked about less money in terms of the town being, having to put out roads and all of that, but actually taking up less land is good for our ecological footprint and all of that. So we'll definitely spend a little bit more time on that in future workshops, but thanks for bringing that up because it's super important.
And do know that, when we have a little bit more time, we do provide some great examples from around the country of what people have done to build energy efficiency and into projects like this.
That's great. So Dan and Mike and Jackie and Kristy, thank you so much for coming on. Elisa, obviously for welcoming us and hosting the whole thing. Do you want to say anything before we sign off?
Nope, just thanks to everybody for coming on. Look forward to seeing everybody next time.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you.
good evening, everyone.